Hello and welcome to World Religions Chapter 1. I'm Stephen Gibbons, and I'm going to narrate slides that I would use as if we were in a face-to-face class. Obviously, this is a recording that you'll be watching online. So if I talk too fast, you can stop the recording, back it up, listen again, and certainly email me with any questions that you might have. The textbook begins by describing various religious practices, and I think it'll be interesting to explore the religious practices and experiences of those of us who are in this class together. You can see we're using Living Religions by Mary Pat Fisher and Robin Reinhardt, 10th edition. A quick look at our learning objectives. After completing this course, students will be able to explain the basic concepts and histories of the major religions, define the vocabulary, and each discipline has its own list of words that it uses to describe specific things, and religion is no different. Describe characteristics common. We often focus on the differences, but certainly there are a lot of things religions have in common. That there are challenges to interfaith dialogue because religions think about things in such different categories, and often just developing a conversation between two different disciplines can be a challenge. Integrate the study of world religions with other academic disciplines, and you'll see that there's a lot of overlap and influence from one discipline to another because it's all describing human experience. Integrate religion within its cultural contexts. Some would say you can't understand a culture until you understand a religion, and religion is a window into a culture, and I would certainly agree. Our textbook begins to define religion as a system of beliefs that usually relates to a higher power, such as a god or gods, and comes from a Latin root that means to tie back or tie again or tie fast, as if the goal is to connect us or tie us to the ultimate reality, past the surface of life to the greater reality that's beneath everything. Of course, the problem is that this greater reality is invisible, at least the vast majority of the time. So these systems might be very organized and structured, like Christianity or Buddhism would be examples of structured systems, or very unstructured and diverse, such as New Age spirituality. The inner dimensions that we experience and talk about is spirituality, and many would say that they are spiritual without being religious, like the lady that's interviewed in Chapter 1. Why are there religions? Well, that's a little like asking why people fall in love, since both behaviors are so complex, so different from each other, and so widespread in human experience. Scientific materialism observes that religion occurs in every culture and sees it as something humans have created rather than a response to a supreme being who has reached out to humans. No, this is a creation of humans, and Ludwig Feuerbach would say religion's a projection of human qualities. We might think of God as a heavenly father or a heavenly mother, projecting these human qualities onto a supreme being. Karl Marx would say religion springs from the desires of economically oppressed people. Marx is famous for his statement calling religion the opiate of the people. And an opium, of course, is a drug that deals with pain, and he would say it's a false attempt at happiness to dull ourselves from the pain of life. Not in the text is 17th century philosopher Thomas Hobbes reasoned that God is an idea that men made up, and about that same time René Descartes concluded, "I think, therefore I am." Doubting his existence, he concluded that he was thinking and therefore he did exist, and he reasoned from his own existence to God's existence. So it's interesting that in that time period Hobbes and Descartes came to rather opposite conclusions about God's existence. Emile Durkheim, the famous sociologist, would say we need structure, and religion is glue that holds society together, so religion is quite functional. Robert Putnam and David Campbell would say something similar, that religious people are more generous, they're healthier, they're better citizens, so religion is functional, although religious people can be manipulated, so that's not so functional. We might think of that as a dysfunction. John Bowker said religion serves the biological purpose of survival. The current Dalai Lama, the 14th Dalai Lama, says religion serves in the war against hatred and war against terror. Erich Fromm, the famous psychologist, said we need a stable frame of reference. Mata Amintradamai, pardon me for not knowing how to pronounce that name from India, says faith in God gives us mental strength, morality, and goodness. Guru Tegh Bahadur, who I believe is from the Sikh tradition, often spelled Sikh, but pronounced Sikh, when we realize the world is a dream, we can start our search for something deeper and more meaningful. Mahatma Gandhi, Mohandas Gandhi, famous for liberating India from British rule, found strength to carry on that campaign from meditating on the famous Hindu scriptures, the Bhagavad Gita. David Stendhal Rast said whenever monks of various traditions meet, within minutes they're talking about death, since that's one of the harsh realities of life, and helps us get to this thing about what is beyond life. There are some terms that are used in our book. Dogma is a system of beliefs, often about invisible things, eternal things, as well as standards for daily living. Faith can be used as both a noun and a verb. So if we describe a system of belief, very much like dogma, and say the Lutheran faith, Catholic faith, we're using faith as a noun. If we have faith in someone, if we believe in someone or something, that would be using faith as a verb and a way for us to relate to the unseen reality. Martin Luther, a Roman Catholic monk and theology student who experienced severe doubt and intense questions, out of this developed such strong convictions he was willing to die for them. So we might say he exercised faith in the dogma that he discovered and found in the New Testament scriptures. William James, one of the early psychologists, believed our consciousness is only thinly divided from a higher consciousness, a little like awakening. We awaken to a higher state of consciousness. And we wonder, what is that higher state of consciousness? Well, that's a mystical question to describe that. George William Russell, an Irish mystic, felt like he came alive to a golden age in his religious experience, and he was previously blind, but then could see. So mysticism is what is beyond blind belief. These special encounters are often described by people as enlightenment, as realization, as illumination, satori, an awakening, a self-knowledge, a gnosis, the Greek word for knowledge, ecstatic communion, coming home, many different terms to describe this religious experience that seems to be very individual, but often experienced by multiple people throughout history. Religious experiences often leave people with a feeling of awe and dread and prompt action. Often these are considered a peak experience in one's life. We might say better than a sexual experience. A peak experience of life, a defining moment of life. And this comes to define a person's life and existence. There is a dualistic understanding between the ordinary things of life and these special spiritual things that function on a separate plane of existence. Rudolf Otto described the spiritual as wholly other, completely other, that it functioned on a totally different level, and led to this term numinous to describe this non-physical existence compared to a phenomenon, something that can be observed. We might see sacred aspects of religion or artifacts that are used in religion and the things that we can observe as phenomenology. But the numinous or numenology would be these things that are experienced in a non-physical way. Joachim Wack has these observations about religious experience, that it is an experience of an unseen reality that often involves a person's whole being. They feel like this is a total experience, most shattering and intense, unlike any other type of experience, and motivates a person to worship, motivates them to act, it motivates them to observe ethical standards, it motivates them to service and to sharing. So religious experience is something that's hard for us to explain, but certainly very much at the core of existence. If we think about different understandings of ultimate reality, The study of comparative religions around the world often tries to describe religion in very broad categories. The profane, or the things that are common or everyday, ordinary, random, practical, or sacred, things that are holy, extraordinary, purposeful, and supernatural. This is the difference between the what of life and the why of life. Some traditions don't make a distinction between the sacred and profane, as if everything is infused with the presence or the connection to the higher plane of existence. Another distinction would be immanent, involved in this world, or transcendent, beyond this world and outside earthly things. Belief in God is theism, from the Greek word theos, which means God, or atheism, the a prefix meaning not a belief in God, belief that there is no God. And we might think of this as on a continuum that are in the class lecture notes: atheism on one extreme, or pantheism, God in everything; animism, God in nature, God, the spirits animate aspects of nature; polytheism, belief in many gods; monism, that there's this supreme underlying reality; non-theistic views of suchness; and monotheistic, saying that God is personal. When God takes on an appearance, that's an incarnation, or sometimes described as a theophany, where God takes on a human experience. Some religions are very exclusivist, saying, well, we have the truth. This is what we know is truth, and other religions are false. Others would say we're all using the same kind of words to describe the same thing, and that would be a universalistic approach. In history, there has been a minority of people who don't believe in God or supreme being, the atheists, but as a matter of fact, most people in human history believe that there's something else out there that's beyond the realm of human experience. Humanism would be a focus on human responsibility to work for the good of all humanity, without necessarily belief in the supernatural. Secularism is living daily life without the influence of religion. In the modern U.S. culture, we tend to think of religious values as very personal and private, and should not necessarily be in the public arena. If you believe that, that's fine, but keep it to yourself. And so we are seeing an increasing secularism in our culture, that religion should be a private thing, and consistent with humanism, that we should work for the good of humanity without necessarily a belief in the supernatural. Ritual would be actions that are performed, anything that we would say would be part of a religious observance. Could be an action, whether it's repeated or done one time. Worship might be very synonymous with ritual. Ritual would be the actions that are often used to attribute worth or worthship or worship to a supreme being or to an idea, recognize value in someone else, and often the big mysteries of life, like birth and death, raising crops, raising a family, the mystery of how all these things happen, are very much tied in with religious ritual and mystery. Anthony Fernando, I think, makes a very relevant observation that even the most illiterate person knows that the gods don't really pick up the food or things offered to them, but it's a ritual of giving what the person has to recognize and attribute worth to the supreme being or entity. And the worshiper is saying that their life really isn't lived just for themselves, but for a connection with this higher ultimate reality. Symbols represent truths or ideas. Carl Jung, the famous psychologist, developed the idea of the collective unconsciousness, or a common memory of archetypal symbols that form the building blocks of many diverse cultures. These symbols may be a wise old man, a great mother, a hero, a shadow, a trickster. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who died in 1778, observed God created man in his own image, and man, being a gentleman, returned the favor. Very much like the idea that religion is something invented by human beings to satisfy an inner need, rather than saying religion is an encounter with a supreme being. An allegory is an extended story, sometimes described as an earthly story with a heavenly meaning, describing a spiritual reality in earthly terms in an attempt to explain things that are beyond ordinary experience and things that we can relate to. Maybe we might say explaining the transcendent in terms of the immanent. Symbols are brought together in a myth or a story that explains how the world or the universe functions or came to be. Joseph Campbell in our textbook saw 4 purposes in myth: mystical, to evoke awe and wonder; cosmological, explaining how the universe came to be. Cosmology is the study of how things came to be, the study of origins; sociological, ordering social life; psychological, opening doors to explore our own inner mind. Because of improved communication and travel, we interact with many different cultures, experiencing globalization, and we find that there are religious traditions that are orthodox around the world. Orthodox, of course, refers to correct beliefs, and we might think not only of Orthodox Christianity, but Orthodox beliefs in other traditions, often stated in a creed or a verbalization, often written or spoken, about what a system of beliefs holds to. Absolutists would say that they hold to the core system of their religious tradition, often saying we're the ones that have the truth, we're the ones that are right. Christians first used the term fundamentalists in the late 19th and early 20th centuries to identify themselves as holding to the fundamentals of the Christian faith, as opposed to people who had drifted away from the basics or the fundamentals. Especially so, the fundamentalist controversy came up in the clash between science and religion. Since then, the term fundamentalist has been used to apply to people so dedicated to their cause that they would resist change or even produce violence against others, pursue violence against others. So we might talk about fundamentalist Islam, not just fundamentalist Christianity. But you get the idea, the core meaning of that term, fundamentalist. Liberals, if someone's liberal, they're generous, so that's certainly a good thing. But liberals, when it comes to religion, are not just generous, but more flexible in applying their faith to changing times. Those who compromise the basics of the faith are called heretics, if you compromise the main ideas or the main tenets. So absolutists often see liberals as heretics, as people who have compromised the really important basic tenets of the faith. Historical critical studies have been engaged by liberals and fundamentalists, or liberals and conservatives, seeking to understand the times and the culture of where religious documents have come from and where the religious tradition has come from. Exegesis is a process of drawing out everything that a text says. Many religions have their sacred text, and modern times have given us a new view of these writings. One paradigm, one way to understand this, is to think about Moses going up on Mount Sinai, where there's a thunderstorm and a cloud, dark cloud shrouding God's presence, the mystery of God's presence, and Moses can enter into God's presence, and he brings the stone tablets, and God with his very own finger writes the 10 Commandments on these stone tablets, sometimes called the 10 Words. Well, Moses got this directly from God, so we know that this is true. We know that this is directly from God. That would be one paradigm for understanding where religious documents come from. We might talk about the inspiration of the sacred text as coming directly from God. Another view, another paradigm, would say that a guru or a teacher gives some teaching. It's recorded by his disciples, embellished over time, Applications are added to the teaching to correct certain false teachings, clarify some teachings. It's been copied before there were printing presses, copied by hand and made mistakes in copying. Others would add figures of speech and spiritual interpretations. So the text in the Sinai paradigm is, the Word of God, coming directly from God. And in layers over time, it's like an onion with various layers, things added to it, and elements of culture and elements of one time period or another time period have been added. And so modern times tries to take a look at these layers of things. And textual criticism is asking, or literary criticism is asking, what was the original text? What are the closest copies? Are there sources that have informed other writers? I mean, we see this even in New Testament studies. The Gospels of Matthew and Luke have a lot of things that are very common, things that are not in the Gospel of Mark. And so it's been theorized that there's a source that Matthew and Luke used, sometimes called Quell, the German word for, or Q, the German word for source. What are the source of this author, of the source of this religious text? We think about literary forms. Is this narrative? Is this a parable? Is this a hymn? Is this a poem? Is this a saying? Is this a miracle story? A little like talking about genre in literature, to talk about the literary form of this. Redactors would be people who would be editors along the way, over time. Maybe they added something, maybe they clarified something, maybe they deleted something that was unclear. So looking at the journey that this religious document had from its start until it finally reached its final form in what we would call canon. Canon would be the accepted or final form of a religious document, rule or standard. And it's very possible that the critics that are looking for these layers added to a religious document might have their own biases and might start to see things that happened in the layers over time. Not all literary criticism is carried out with scientific objectivity. Criticism is commonly divided between higher criticism that seems to assume the text is an amalgam of layers, like an onion, and lower criticism that allows the text to speak for itself and assumes that the authors and editors have not changed the meaning over time. Higher criticism can have a bias against the supernatural, almost assuming that the supernatural doesn't exist, very much like materialism that we've talked about, and assume that there has to be a logical, natural explanation for a miracle, or that the supernatural doesn't really exist. One of the most important activities is to look for the bias of any author, and even the bias of any teacher, and ask if it has colored their work. One of the more difficult controversies with religion is the trying to mesh science and religion. Plato distrusted the senses and thought that the physical world was inferior to the world of ideas and reason. This gave rise to the famous Greek dualism that the soul or the mind is superior to the body. The Judeo-Christian view is that the world and all that in it is created for people, and we're created to rule over it. During the Enlightenment in the 18th century, reason was more respected, and religion was viewed with more skepticism, leading to materialism. Only the physical world is real. So you see there's a variety of opinions as to which is more important. Is religion more important, or is science more important? I'd like to point out that both science and religion are trying to do the same thing, to understand the world and how it operates and how we should live in it. Science and religion are often seen as enemies, but they're both actually have something in common. Science looks for laws, like the laws of gravity or the laws of thermodynamics, that explain how reality functions, and religion seeks to explain how our lives function within the context of this earth, within our physical reality. So their goals are not so far apart, but the difference came as modern science developed in the Age of Enlightenment sought to explain the natural world, the phenomenon of the natural world apart from a God or a creator. Scientific materialism is the view that claims that the supernatural is imaginary and all that exists is the physical, natural world. There's no such thing as the supernatural. Ludwig Feuerbach, who died in 1872, argues that deities are personifications of virtues such as wisdom and power. And instead of man being created in God's image, he saw men or people as creating God, very much like human beings. Sigmund Freud saw religion as a universal obsessional neurosis, or a psychic need to create a super parent. Karl Marx saw religion as the means that the powerful use to control the masses. And the masses gained comfort from the promise of eternal rewards. So that's why he called religion the opiate of the people, because it eased their pain. Charles Darwin developed the theory of natural selection, which gave an explanation of different life forms without involving God in the process, without there being a creator. Science has changed a lot in the last century with quantum physics and the famous German scientist Werner Heisenberg. No, Heisenberg was not originally a nickname for a chemistry teacher who decided to produce meth to supplement his income. But Werner Heisenberg said that these particles that are smaller than protons and neutrons and electrons, the subnuclear particles, we can't know a particle's speed and its location at the same time. Heisenberg's famous uncertainty principle. So at the very smallest level of reality, there's this uncertainty built in. And it makes us wonder if the ultimate questions of what's real and what's beyond our physical world, if there's not uncertainty built into that too. Physics goes further and further to describe subnuclear particles as the building blocks and finds out, well, they're not the smallest particles. String theory suggests that the basic building blocks of matter are these tiny vibrating strings. Summer of 2013 saw evidence for the smallest particle with mass, that would be the Higgs boson. So on it goes. Science goes smaller and smaller, questioning many of its own principles, and so even science isn't so cut and dried. One of the major problems is origin for both science and religion. How could the universe develop with all its mysteries and intricacies, incredibly large as we look through telescopes with increasing power to see galaxies beyond our own and how vast they are, and then increasingly small as we find that subnuclear particles break down into smaller and smaller particles? Did all this happen because of mechanical chance, or was there a supernatural power guiding this? For instance, gravity is an exact strength on this planet, and it's the exact strength of gravity from planet to planet actually allowed stars to form. So if gravity would have been a little bit stronger or a little bit weaker, our universe just would not function. The Human Genome Project has revealed amazing detail and complexity in our own genetic code. Chemistry has its detailed protein chains and Krebs cycles. Even the Big Bang Theory is inadequate to explain where all matter came from. The idea is that all matter collapsed in on itself to become infinitely dense, the so-called singularity, and then exploded and set the universe in motion as we know it. Well, the Big Bang Theory does not explain where matter came from, or it doesn't explain that ever since a nanosecond after the singularity, the laws of physics were fixed, and the universe functions according to these laws of physics. Well, where did that come from? It's as if the universe has a mind of its own. Did that come from a creator, or does the universe have a mind of its own? Well, when we think about how science and religion mesh together, we have four options. We can think of them as conflicting, as if science and religion are enemies. We can think of them as two parallel truths because they deal with the physical and the non-physical, two truths that are functioning in parallel universes almost, and that they don't intersect. Or we can think about dialogue, finding common ground to soften their absolute truth claims, or could we possibly integrate them? So maybe science and religion ought to listen to each other. A major topic these days is women in religion. It's pretty safe to say that religion is usually a male-dominated structure, patriarchal. The highest deity is usually male, although female deities do exist in the ancient world, and sometimes in the modern world too. Generally, worship of a goddess has been suppressed, and participation of women has also been marginalized. Women in the ancient world were regarded as property of males and were expected to be obedient or at least supportive, but not in roles of leadership. The feminist movement, active for over 150 years in the United States, is also active in religion. Instead of someone else telling her who she is, she's deciding for herself who she is, and she's often challenging traditional rules in religion, traditional gender-exclusive language, and social problems such as violence, poverty, and environmental issues. Buddhist Jacqueline Kramer observes that the motherhood, a life of service for others, has seldom been seen as a spiritual path, even though the goal is very similar to other, quote, servants of God. There are some negative aspects in religion. If we define charisma as personal appeal or power, then people with more charisma or their personal appeal can be given a lot more power and influence than others, and often be very influential over a large number of others. Well, power can be misused. And people with charisma may or may not be connected to great spiritual truths. Maybe they're just connected to a source of great income for themselves. And religion can be misused for personal gain. They may serve self with attention and power over others people and convince other people that they know God or they know God's will and make decisions for others and control their lives. Religion often teaches right and wrong, how to make ethical choices, and since we all need to make these choices, some can exaggerate the guilt of themselves or exaggerate the guilt of others, and that can be used to push people to unhealthy obsessions motivated by religion and focus on punishment of sin and retribution. Religion can be focused on the invisible and preoccupied with heaven, like the old saying, someone is so heavenly minded they're no earthly good, and that can be escape from the realities of life or not deal with these problems and just trust that God's going to work everything out without doing our part. Psychologist John Wellwood calls this spiritual bypassing. Political power can be seen as something that's involved with religion. Our country is involved in a war against terrorism, and religion is a huge factor in motivating both sides of the war on terror. Historically, religion has motivated many wars to rid the earth of unbelievers and replace them with true believers. The potential for violence and destruction in the name of religion is huge, and a huge reason for understanding other religions and learning to respect differing beliefs. Since religion happens in this human context, we can use many other studies of human beings, such as the study of history, to understand how religion is developed, or the study of sociology to see how society is organized, the study of psychology about how we think and act and process our emotions, and certainly helps us gives us a window to understanding religion. The study of anthropology or politics or economics or feminism are all relevant to our study of religion. We may wonder if it's possible to be objective in our study of religion, but I hope we all agree with the closing statement of Chapter 1 that we should listen carefully to people of all faiths as they tell their stories and learn to understand their views.